Delete your old mind. Reprogram the way you think. Many people try to change their life by adjusting their actions, their goals, or their environment. Yet after some time, they notice the same patterns returning. The same doubts appear, the same habits repeat, and the same decisions quietly guide them back to familiar outcomes. This happens because behavior often follows something deeper, the way the mind has been trained to think. The mind learns through repetition. Over years, beliefs, reactions, and habits form a mental structure that feels natural, even when it no longer helps you grow. Because it feels familiar, you rarely question it. This audiobook explores a powerful idea. Progress sometimes requires removing outdated patterns of thinking. When you begin observing and replacing the thoughts that limit you, your actions slowly change as well. A new direction in life often begins with a new way of thinking. Chapter 1. Why the Mind Repeats Old Patterns. A man once promised himself that he would change his life. He would wake earlier, work harder, speak with confidence, and stop the habits that kept pulling him backward. For a few days, the effort felt powerful. He felt like a different person. But slowly, something quiet began to return. The same thoughts that had always lived inside his mind started whispering again. You will fail. You have tried this before. Why bother? Without noticing, he began making the same choices he had made many times before. This is how the mind repeats old patterns. It does not always happen because a person lacks discipline. It happens because the mind prefers familiarity over change. The brain remembers what it has practiced the most. Just like a road formed by many footsteps becomes easier to walk, thoughts that repeat for years become the default direction of the mind. Even when a person tries to move forward, the mind quietly guides them back to what it already knows. When a child grows up hearing certain ideas about life, those ideas slowly become invisible rules. Perhaps they hear that success is difficult, that people cannot be trusted, or that they are not capable of great things. These thoughts may not feel like beliefs at first. They feel like facts about reality. Years later, the same person may wonder why they hesitate before opportunities, why they doubt themselves before even trying. The answer is hidden inside the patterns that formed earlier in life. The mind repeats what it has practiced for the longest time. Like a song played again and again, the melody becomes automatic. The person may want to think differently, but the old mental rhythm continues in the background. This is why simply deciding to change rarely works immediately. The mind does not change in a moment. It changes through awareness, patience, and the slow replacement of patterns that have been repeating for years without question. Consider a man who has walked the same path through a forest every day for 10 years. That path becomes clear and smooth because his feet have traveled it thousands of times. Now imagine that one morning he decides to take a new direction. At first, the ground feels difficult and uncomfortable. There are branches, stones, and uneven soil. The old path is still there, wide and easy. The mind works in the same way. Thoughts that have repeated for many years become smooth mental pathways. They require no effort to follow, but new ways of thinking feel unfamiliar and challenging at the beginning. The mind naturally returns to the path it knows best. This is not weakness, it is simply how learning works. Repetition creates strength. The more often a thought is practiced, the more natural it becomes. This explains why the mind keeps repeating old patterns even when a person truly wants to move in a new direction. Many people believe their thoughts are simply reflections of reality. They assume the voice in their mind is always correct. Yet most thoughts are not careful conclusions. They are echoes of previous experiences, fears, and assumptions that have repeated long enough to feel true. When the mind has repeated a certain pattern for years, it stops questioning it. A person may believe they are unlucky, incapable, or always misunderstood. Because these thoughts have been repeated so many times, they begin shaping how the person sees the world. every event is interpreted through that same lens. A small difficulty becomes proof that failure is inevitable. A minor mistake becomes evidence that they are not good enough. The mind quietly filters reality to match the pattern it already knows. In this way, old thoughts continue repeating, not because they are accurate, but because they have been practiced long enough to feel familiar and safe. There is a strange comfort in familiar thinking, even when it causes pain. The mind often chooses what is predictable instead of what is beneficial. A person may remain inside limiting beliefs simply because they know how those beliefs feel. Change introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty makes the mind uneasy. For example, someone who has spent years believing they cannot succeed may secretly fear the responsibility that success would bring. The old identity, even if it is limiting, feels known and manageable. This is why people sometimes sabotage their own progress. The mind is protecting the identity it has practiced for years. It does not recognize that a new identity could create growth and freedom. Instead, it quietly pulls the person back toward the familiar version of themselves. Without awareness, this cycle continues endlessly. The mind repeats what it has rehearsed, even when those patterns quietly prevent a better life from unfolding. Habits of thought are built slowly through small repetitions. A person might complain about their situation each day without realizing that the habit of complaining strengthens a particular mindset. Another person might constantly compare themselves to others, slowly building a belief that they are always behind. Over time, these small thoughts accumulate into powerful mental patterns. The mind becomes trained to react in predictable ways. When a challenge appears, the reaction arrives automatically. The person does not pause to question the thought because it feels normal. Yet what feels normal may simply be what has been repeated the most. The mind is not designed to constantly analyze every belief it holds. Instead, it stores familiar reactions and uses them again and again. This process saves mental energy, but it also means that outdated patterns can remain active long after they stop serving the person's growth. A young woman once failed an important exam. It was only one moment in her life, but the experience left a deep impression. She began telling herself a quiet story. "I am not intelligent enough." Years passed, and she avoided opportunities that required confidence in her abilities. Whenever a new challenge appeared, the same thought returned automatically. The mind had created a pattern based on a single painful memory. That memory repeated inside her thinking until it became a belief about who she was. In reality, the belief was never carefully examined. It was simply repeated until it felt permanent. This is how the mind works. It often turns temporary experiences into long-term mental patterns. Without awareness, a single moment can shape the direction of thinking for many years. The person begins living according to a conclusion that was never truly tested or questioned. Another reason the mind repeats old patterns is because attention often follows emotion. Thoughts connected to strong emotions become deeply memorized. If a person experiences embarrassment, fear, or rejection, the mind stores the memory with special importance. Later, when a similar situation appears, the mind immediately recalls the old thought pattern. It tries to protect the person from repeating the painful experience. But protection sometimes becomes limitation. The mind may avoid situations that could actually lead to growth. Instead of allowing new experiences to reshape understanding, it repeats the old conclusion again and again. Emotional memories become powerful anchors for repeated thinking. The person believes they are being cautious or realistic, when in reality, the mind is simply replaying an old emotional pattern that has never been fully understood or questioned. Social environments also reinforce mental repetition. When people spend years surrounded by the same attitudes and conversations, those ideas begin shaping their thinking. If everyone around a person constantly complains about life, success may start to feel impossible. If people frequently talk about fear, danger, and limitation, The mind absorbs those perspectives. The human brain is deeply influenced by its environment. Thoughts spread quietly between people through conversation, observation, and shared beliefs. Over time, the mind begins repeating the patterns it hears most often. The person may not realize how much their thinking has been shaped by the voices around them, yet those voices become internal dialogues that continue even when no one else is present. The mind repeats what it has been exposed to repeatedly, reinforcing mental patterns that feel normal simply because they have been heard many times. Sometimes the mind repeats old patterns simply because the person has never paused to observe them. Many people move through life reacting automatically to situations without reflecting on the thoughts guiding their reactions. A challenge appears, and the mind instantly produces its familiar response. The person believes the reaction is natural and unavoidable. But if they were to slow down and observe their thinking, they might notice the pattern repeating. They might see that the same assumptions appear again and again in different situations. Awareness begins with observation. When a person notices the pattern clearly, the repetition becomes less invisible. Instead of blindly following the thought, they can question it. This moment of awareness creates space between the person and the pattern. That small space is where change quietly begins. Without observation, however, the mind continues repeating its old script indefinitely. The repetition of mental patterns is not a permanent prison. It is simply the result of repeated learning. The same process that created the old patterns can also create new ones. When a person begins paying attention to their thoughts, they slowly weaken the influence of automatic thinking. They start noticing when the familiar voice of doubt or limitation appears. Instead of believing it immediately, they pause and ask whether the thought is actually true. At first, this feels uncomfortable because the mind prefers its old pathways. But each moment of awareness creates a new direction. Like carving a fresh trail through a forest, the path becomes easier the more it is walked. Over time, the mind learns a different rhythm of thinking. The patterns that once controlled behavior slowly lose their power as new ways of thinking become practiced and strengthened. Understanding why the mind repeats old patterns is the first step toward transforming them. When people realize that many of their thoughts are simply rehearsed habits rather than permanent truths, something powerful changes. The mind begins to feel less like a rigid structure and more like a system that can evolve. Each thought becomes an opportunity to choose direction instead of blindly following repetition. Slowly, the person begins stepping away from the familiar path that once defined their thinking. The old patterns may still appear, but they no longer control every decision. Awareness turns automatic reactions into conscious choices, and in that quiet shift, the mind begins discovering a freedom it never knew it had before. Chapter 2. Thoughts shape daily decisions. A man once believed that the biggest decisions in life were the ones that changed everything. He imagined crossroads like choosing a career, moving to a new city, or starting a business. Yet most of life does not change in dramatic moments. Instead, it moves quietly through small decisions made every day. What time to wake up, whether to begin work or delay it, how to respond to criticism, whether to try again after failure. These choices appear ordinary, almost invisible. But behind each decision stands a thought. Before a person acts, the mind quickly interprets the situation and suggests a direction. These thoughts are often so fast that they go unnoticed. A person may believe they simply decided, but in reality their thinking quietly guided the choice long before the action happened. In this way, thoughts shape the daily path of life. What a person repeatedly thinks becomes the compass that directs their behavior. Imagine a young worker entering a meeting where new ideas are being discussed. He has an idea that could improve the project, but before he speaks, a thought appears. What if they think it's foolish? That single thought quietly changes his decision. He stays silent. No one ever hears the idea. The opportunity passes without resistance because the thought arrived first. This is how thoughts influence decisions without creating obvious conflict. The mind does not shout instructions. It whispers small suggestions that feel reasonable. Another person in the same situation might think, "This could help the team." That thought leads to speaking confidently. The action is different because the thought behind it was different. Both individuals faced the same moment, yet their internal dialogue guided them toward opposite choices. This illustrates a powerful truth. The decisions people make are often reflections of the thoughts they allow to guide their perception of the situation. Daily life is full of moments where thoughts silently steer direction. When a person wakes up in the morning, the first thoughts often determine the tone of the day. One mind might say, "Today will be exhausting," while another quietly thinks, "Today is a chance to move forward." These thoughts may seem simple, but they influence behavior in subtle ways. The person expecting exhaustion moves slowly, avoids challenges, and focuses on difficulties. The person expecting opportunity approaches tasks with curiosity and energy. Over time, these repeated daily decisions shape entirely different lives. It is not the events themselves that create the difference. It is the interpretation of those events through thought. The mind acts as a translator between experience and action. When the translation changes, the decisions that follow also change. The direction of life gradually shifts according to the thoughts that become habitual companions in everyday moments. A student preparing for an exam might sit at their desk with two possible paths before them. One thought might say, "This subject is too difficult for me." Another might suggest, "If I focus for an hour, I can improve." The decision to study or avoid the work depends entirely on which thought becomes dominant. In many cases, people do not consciously choose the thought they follow. The mind presents a familiar pattern, and the person automatically believes it. Over months and years, these small decisions accumulate into habits of behavior. The student who repeatedly follows discouraging thoughts slowly loses confidence. The student who listens to encouraging reasoning continues practicing and improving. Both started with similar ability, yet their thinking created different daily decisions. The outcome was not determined by intelligence alone, but by the mental conversation that shaped each moment of choice. Thoughts also influence how people interpret obstacles. When a challenge appears, the mind quickly assigns meaning to it. One person might think, "This problem proves I am not capable." Another might think, "This problem is teaching me something important." The situation remains identical, yet the decisions that follow become completely different. The first person withdraws, avoids risk, and protects themselves from further disappointment. The second person experiments, learns, and adapts. Over time, these repeated decisions build entirely different levels of skill and confidence. What appears from the outside as determination or resilience often begins with a simple thought that reframes the challenge. The mind determines whether an obstacle becomes a stopping point or a training ground. By shaping the interpretation of difficulty, thoughts quietly influence whether a person moves forward or remains standing at the edge of opportunity. Relationships are also shaped by the thoughts that guide daily reactions. Imagine someone receiving a short message from a friend that feels distant or cold. One mind might immediately think, "They must be upset with me." That thought leads to worry, defensive behavior, or emotional withdrawal. Another mind might think, "Perhaps they are simply busy today." That interpretation leads to patience and calm. The same message created two entirely different emotional responses because the thoughts interpreting it were different. Over time, these mental interpretations influence how relationships develop. A mind trained to expect negativity may react with suspicion or anxiety. A mind trained to consider neutral explanations may respond with understanding. In both cases, the thoughts behind the reaction guide the decisions that follow. Communication, trust, and emotional stability are shaped not only by external behavior, but by the internal thoughts that interpret each interaction. Consider a shop owner who experiences a slow week in business. One thought might arise: customers are disappearing, my efforts are useless. That belief may lead to discouragement and reduced effort. Another thought might say, this is a signal to improve my strategy. That perspective inspires problem-solving and creativity. The same event has occurred, yet the thinking behind it directs entirely different decisions. The first response closes possibilities. The second response searches for solutions. Over time, repeated decisions based on constructive thinking gradually transform the situation. The difference between persistence and surrender often begins with a single interpretation of an event. Thoughts act as lenses through which reality is viewed. When the lens changes, the options a person sees also change. In this way, thoughts quietly determine whether challenges become reasons to stop or opportunities to evolve. Many people assume that motivation is the force behind productive decisions. While motivation can be helpful, thoughts often play a deeper role. A person may not feel particularly motivated to exercise or work, yet if their thinking strongly values discipline and long-term progress, they will act anyway. The thought becomes stronger than the temporary feeling. On the other hand, if a person believes comfort is more important than progress, they will likely avoid effort whenever motivation fades. The mind quietly prioritizes certain ideas over others. These priorities guide daily decisions even when emotions fluctuate. When thoughts consistently support growth, actions gradually align with improvement. When thoughts support avoidance or fear, actions follow that direction instead. The key influence behind behavior is rarely the situation itself. It is the interpretation that the mind gives to the situation before a decision is made. Another example appears in the way people handle mistakes. When an error occurs, the mind immediately creates a story around the event. One person might think, this mistake shows I should stop trying. Another might think, this mistake is information I can learn from. The decision that follows depends on the meaning assigned to the mistake. The first person withdraws from the activity, believing it confirms their limitations. The second person studies the error and adjusts their approach. Over time, these different responses accumulate into entirely different levels of experience and skill. The person who continues learning becomes more capable simply because they decided to keep practicing. The mind's interpretation of mistakes therefore shapes the future of development. Thoughts determine whether failure becomes a conclusion or a lesson. Even simple habits are guided by thought patterns. A person deciding whether to scroll through their phone late at night or go to sleep early is responding to a thought. One thought might say, just a few minutes of entertainment will help me relax. Another might say, rest will help me think clearly tomorrow. Both options feel reasonable depending on which thought becomes dominant. The repeated decision eventually forms a habit. Over weeks and months, that habit shapes energy levels, productivity, and emotional stability. Many habits that seem automatic were once small decisions influenced by a thought that appeared ordinary. By observing these thoughts more carefully, a person can begin influencing the decisions that form their daily routines. Change does not begin with dramatic events. It begins with the quiet recognition of the thoughts guiding everyday choices. Confidence is also influenced by the thoughts that accompany decisions. A confident individual is not someone who never experiences doubt. Rather, they are someone who has learned to question the thoughts that encourage hesitation. When the mind says, you might fail, they respond with reasoning such as, failure will teach me something valuable. This small shift in thinking allows action to continue despite uncertainty. Confidence grows because the person repeatedly chooses progress instead of retreat. Over time, These decisions strengthen the belief that challenges can be managed. The mind learns through evidence created by experience. When thoughts encourage constructive action, each decision adds new evidence that reinforces capability. Confidence becomes the natural result of decisions guided by balanced thinking instead of fearful assumptions. Understanding how thoughts shape daily decisions reveals an important responsibility. Every thought has the potential to influence direction. While not every thought deserves attention, the patterns that repeat most frequently eventually guide behavior. When a person begins observing these patterns, they gain the ability to question them. Instead of following the first idea that appears, they can choose the thought that leads toward growth. This small pause between thought and action becomes a powerful turning point. Daily decisions start to reflect intention rather than habit. Over time, the accumulation of thoughtful decisions gradually transforms the course of life. The mind becomes less of an unconscious driver and more of a conscious guide directing each step forward. Chapter 3. Familiar thinking feels safe. A traveler once arrived in a town where every street looked the same. The houses were familiar, the paths predictable, and the people repeated the same routines every day. At first, the traveler felt a strange calmness walking through those streets. Nothing was surprising. Nothing demanded adjustment. The mind loves this feeling. Familiarity creates the illusion of safety. When thoughts repeat the same patterns, the mind relaxes because it knows exactly what to expect. Even if those thoughts lead to limitation, they still feel comfortable. Many people stay inside the same mental streets for years, not because those thoughts help them grow, but because they recognize them. The mind quietly chooses what it knows over what it does not understand. New thinking can feel uncertain and uncomfortable. The old patterns, even if they lead nowhere, seem easier to follow simply because the mind has walked those paths many times before. A young artist once hesitated to share her work with anyone. She told herself that people might not understand it, or that criticism would be painful. The thought appeared so naturally that she never questioned it. It had lived in her mind for years, repeating quietly every time she considered showing her creativity. That thought became familiar, and because it was familiar, it felt safe. The mind often protects patterns that are comfortable, even when they prevent progress. The artist believed she was avoiding embarrassment, but in reality she was protecting a familiar fear. When thinking becomes repetitive, it forms a psychological shelter. Inside that shelter, a person avoids uncertainty. But that shelter can also become a silent barrier that keeps opportunity outside. The mind convinces itself that safety lies in staying where it has always been, even if that place slowly limits growth and possibility. Familiar thinking acts like an old chair in a quiet room. It may not be beautiful or comfortable anymore, yet a person continues sitting in it simply because it has always been there. Changing the chair requires effort. It requires movement, adjustment, and a willingness to try something different. The mind often behaves the same way with thoughts. A belief that has existed for years becomes part of the mental furniture. A person may not remember when it first appeared, but they continue using it automatically. They sit inside that belief every day without noticing it. The thought becomes part of their identity. This is why familiar thinking feels secure. It blends into the background of life until it seems permanent. Yet what feels permanent may only be a habit that has never been examined. Once a person begins questioning the chair they have been sitting in, they may realize it was never necessary to remain there. A businessman once refused to explore a new idea because it seemed too different from what he had always done. His company had operated the same way for decades, and every decision followed a familiar pattern. When someone suggested innovation, his mind immediately produced a thought. If the old method worked before, it should continue working. That thought protected the comfort of tradition. Yet comfort can quietly become resistance to improvement. Familiar thinking reassures the mind that change is unnecessary. It tells a story of stability and certainty. But the world rarely remains still. Situations evolve, opportunities appear, and challenges demand new approaches. When thinking remains trapped inside the past, progress slows. The mind continues repeating what once worked instead of adapting to what is needed now. The illusion of safety becomes a quiet obstacle that prevents new ideas from entering. The mind often interprets unfamiliar ideas as potential threats. When a person hears something that challenges their long-held beliefs, discomfort appears immediately. The mind begins defending its familiar position. It searches for reasons to dismiss the new perspective. This reaction does not mean the new idea is wrong. It simply means the mind is protecting the comfort of its existing patterns. Familiar thinking feels stable because it requires no adjustment. The person does not need to reconsider their understanding of the world. They do not need to question their identity. Everything remains predictable. But growth often begins where predictability ends. When a person allows unfamiliar ideas to be examined instead of rejected, the mind slowly expands its perspective. What once felt threatening begins to feel enlightening. The discomfort of new thinking gradually transforms into the clarity that comes from understanding more deeply. A man who had lived in the same village his entire life once traveled to a distant city. At first, everything felt overwhelming. The streets were crowded, the language sounded different, and the rhythm of life moved faster than he expected. After a few days, he began to notice something surprising. The unfamiliar environment that once felt intimidating slowly became interesting. Curiosity replaced anxiety. The mind learned to adapt. Thinking works in a similar way. At the beginning, unfamiliar thoughts create discomfort because they challenge the patterns the mind has practiced for years. Yet if a person remains open long enough, the unfamiliar becomes understandable. The mind expands its boundaries. What once seemed strange becomes part of a new perspective. Safety does not always come from staying within old patterns. Sometimes it emerges from learning that the mind can adapt to new ideas without losing its stability. Fear often hides inside familiar thinking. Not always obvious fear, but a quiet hesitation toward anything unknown. A person may believe they are simply being cautious or realistic, but their thinking may actually be protecting them from uncertainty. The mind prefers situations where it already knows the outcome. Familiar thoughts promise predictability. They suggest that remaining inside the same mental patterns will prevent mistakes. Yet mistakes are often the teachers that lead to improvement. When thinking never changes, learning slows down. The mind becomes comfortable but stagnant. Fear, disguised as familiarity, can quietly limit a person's experience of life. Once someone recognizes that familiar thinking may be protecting comfort rather than truth, they gain the courage to examine those thoughts more honestly. There was once a student who believed mathematics was impossible for him to understand. The belief came from a few early struggles in school. Years passed, and each time he encountered numbers, the same thought appeared automatically. This is not for me. The thought felt natural because it had been repeated so many times. Familiar thinking had turned a temporary difficulty into a permanent identity. The student never noticed how much his mind relied on that belief to maintain a sense of certainty. If he questioned it, he would have to risk discovering something new about himself. Familiar thinking allowed him to avoid that uncertainty. Only when he slowly began practicing again did he realize that the belief had never been absolute. It had simply been a thought repeated until it felt safe enough to believe without questioning. Social environments also strengthen familiar thinking. When people spend time with others who share the same assumptions, those ideas become reinforced repeatedly. Conversations repeat the same conclusions about life, success, and possibility. Over time, the mind begins accepting those perspectives as normal truths. A person may not realize that their thinking has been shaped by the collective beliefs of the group around them. The comfort of belonging encourages agreement. Challenging those shared thoughts may feel uncomfortable because it risks disagreement or isolation. Yet progress often requires independent thinking. When someone begins exploring ideas beyond the familiar environment, the mind gradually recognizes that many beliefs were simply inherited rather than chosen. This realization opens the door to new perspectives that once seemed impossible to imagine. The brain is designed to conserve energy, and familiar thinking requires very little effort. When a thought has been repeated for years, the brain processes it quickly and efficiently. New thoughts, however, demand attention and mental energy. The brain must analyze them, compare them with previous beliefs, and decide whether they should be accepted or rejected. This effort explains why the mind often prefers its old patterns. Familiar thinking allows the brain to operate on automatic settings. While this efficiency is useful in many situations, it can also prevent meaningful reflection. When thinking becomes too automatic, important assumptions remain unquestioned. The person moves through life guided by patterns they have never consciously evaluated. Growth often begins the moment a person becomes curious about their familiar thinking. Instead of accepting every thought as truth, they begin asking simple questions. Why do I believe this? Is this thought helping me move forward? Where did this belief come from? These questions introduce awareness into the mind. Familiar thinking loses some of its authority when it is examined carefully. The person begins noticing how many thoughts are simply habits rather than conclusions. This awareness creates freedom. It allows the mind to choose which beliefs deserve to remain and which ones should be replaced by more constructive understanding. When familiar thinking is observed instead of blindly followed, something powerful happens. The mind realizes it is capable of learning beyond its previous limits. The old patterns no longer appear as permanent structures. They appear as habits that once served a purpose but may no longer be necessary. With patience, a person can gently expand their thinking without losing stability. The mind begins exploring new possibilities while still respecting the lessons of past experience. Safety is no longer defined by repetition alone. It becomes the quiet confidence that the mind can adapt, grow, and discover better ways of understanding the world. Chapter 4. Awareness reveals mental habits. Many people move through their days believing they are thinking freely, yet much of their thinking follows invisible patterns that operate automatically. These patterns are mental habits formed through repetition, emotion, and experience. Because they have been repeated for so long, they often feel natural and unquestionable. Awareness is the moment when a person begins to notice these patterns instead of blindly following them. It is like turning on a light in a room that has always been dim. Suddenly, details become visible that were previously ignored. Thoughts that once felt like unquestionable truths start to appear as simple mental reactions. This shift is quiet but powerful. The mind begins recognizing that many of its responses are not carefully chosen decisions but rehearsed habits repeating themselves. Awareness does not immediately change those habits, but it exposes them. Once a pattern is visible, it can no longer operate completely unnoticed. This is the beginning of real mental transformation. Mental habits often develop so gradually that people forget they were ever learned. A person might believe they are naturally pessimistic, impatient, or doubtful, without realizing those tendencies formed over years of repeated thinking. The brain strengthens whatever it practices most often. Each repeated thought reinforces the same mental pathway. Eventually, the habit becomes automatic. Awareness interrupts this automatic process. When someone pauses to observe their thoughts, instead of instantly believing them, the pattern becomes visible. Instead of reacting immediately, they begin to notice how the mind produces the same conclusions again and again. This moment of observation is subtle but important. The person begins to see that their thinking is not fixed. It is shaped by patterns that can be recognized and eventually adjusted. Without awareness, these patterns continue operating silently in the background, influencing decisions and emotions without ever being questioned. Awareness changes the relationship a person has with their thoughts. Instead of feeling controlled by them, they begin observing them from a slight distance. A thought appears, but the person no longer feels obligated to follow it instantly. They notice its tone, its assumptions, and its familiarity. This space between the thought and the reaction creates a new form of freedom. The mind becomes less reactive and more reflective. Over time, the person begins recognizing how often the same thoughts appear in different situations. The same doubts arise before challenges. The same defensive reactions appear during disagreements. The same fears surface whenever uncertainty enters the picture. These patterns once felt like natural responses, but awareness reveals that they are habits repeating themselves. Once the repetition becomes clear, the person gains the ability to respond differently instead of continuing the automatic cycle. One of the most surprising discoveries people make through awareness is how quickly the mind produces judgments. A situation appears, and within seconds the mind assigns meaning to it. A delay becomes interpreted as failure. A disagreement becomes interpreted as rejection. These interpretations feel immediate and convincing, yet they often come from familiar mental habits rather than careful reasoning. Awareness slows down this process. Instead of accepting the first interpretation that appears, the person begins examining it. They ask whether the thought is truly accurate or simply a familiar reaction. This small pause creates clarity. The mind becomes less likely to jump to conclusions and more capable of thoughtful evaluation. Over time, the habit of automatic judgment weakens. The person learns that not every thought deserves immediate belief. Some thoughts are simply echoes of previous experiences repeating themselves out of habit. Awareness also reveals how emotions are connected to mental habits. When certain thoughts repeat frequently, they create predictable emotional responses. A person who often thinks about worst-case scenarios will frequently feel anxious. Someone who constantly compares themselves to others may regularly feel inadequate. These emotions do not appear randomly. They follow the patterns of thought that have been repeated for years. Awareness allows a person to trace emotions back to their mental origins. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the emotion itself, they begin examining the thinking that produced it. This insight reduces the sense of helplessness many people feel when dealing with strong emotions. When the source becomes visible, the reaction becomes easier to understand. The person realizes that emotional patterns are often reflections of mental habits that have been quietly repeating beneath the surface. As awareness develops, the mind begins recognizing its own preferences. Some thoughts are drawn toward comfort, others toward caution, and some toward avoidance. The brain naturally seeks efficiency, which means it prefers familiar patterns over new ones. This preference explains why mental habits can remain unchanged for long periods. Awareness challenges this automatic preference by bringing conscious attention to it. When a person notices that their mind repeatedly chooses the easiest interpretation or the safest conclusion, they begin questioning whether that pattern truly serves their growth. The act of questioning introduces flexibility into thinking. Instead of relying on the same response every time, the mind becomes capable of considering alternatives. This gradual flexibility allows new mental habits to form alongside the old ones, creating a more balanced and adaptable way of thinking. The practice of awareness does not require dramatic effort. It begins with simple observation during ordinary moments. A person might notice the thought that appears when they make a mistake. They might observe the reaction that surfaces when someone disagrees with them. These moments reveal the mind's habitual responses. Over time, observation becomes more natural. The person becomes curious about how their thinking operates. Instead of judging themselves for their thoughts, they study them with interest. This approach removes unnecessary self-criticism and replaces it with understanding. The goal of awareness is not to eliminate thoughts, but to understand their patterns. When the mind feels observed rather than suppressed, it gradually becomes calmer and more transparent. Thoughts still appear, but they lose some of their automatic authority over behavior. Another important aspect of awareness is recognizing the difference between thoughts and facts. Many thoughts appear convincing simply because they feel familiar. The mind repeats certain assumptions until they seem unquestionable. Awareness reveals that thoughts are interpretations rather than objective truths. When a person begins recognizing this distinction, their thinking becomes more flexible. They realize that a thought like, "I always fail," is not a factual statement, but a mental pattern shaped by past experiences. This realization creates space for alternative perspectives. The person may begin considering evidence that contradicts the old belief. Over time, new thoughts start replacing the rigid conclusions that once dominated their thinking. Awareness, therefore, acts as a bridge between automatic habits and deliberate understanding. Awareness also strengthens patience with the process of mental change. Many people become frustrated when their old patterns continue appearing, even after they have recognized them. Yet mental habits formed over years cannot disappear instantly. Awareness does not erase them immediately, but it weakens their influence over time. Each moment of observation reduces the automatic power of the pattern. The person becomes less likely to follow it without reflection. Gradually, the brain begins forming alternative responses that feel more balanced and constructive. This slow transformation may feel subtle, but its effects accumulate steadily. The mind becomes less reactive and more intentional in its thinking. As awareness deepens, the mind begins developing a sense of internal clarity. Thoughts become easier to distinguish from emotions, assumptions, and external influences. The person starts recognizing when their thinking is shaped by fear, by past experiences, or by the expectations of others. This clarity creates a more stable mental environment. Instead of being carried away by every thought that appears, the person learns to evaluate them calmly. This evaluation leads to better decisions and more balanced reactions. The mind becomes less chaotic and more focused, because awareness continuously illuminates the patterns that once remained hidden. Awareness also changes how a person relates to mistakes. When mental habits are invisible, mistakes often trigger self-criticism or frustration. The mind reacts automatically with familiar judgments. Awareness interrupts this reaction by encouraging reflection instead of blame. The person begins asking what thought pattern led to the mistake and whether that pattern can be adjusted. This approach transforms mistakes into learning opportunities rather than personal failures. The mind becomes curious instead of defensive. Each experience becomes a chance to refine thinking rather than reinforce negative beliefs. When awareness becomes a regular part of thinking, the mind gradually evolves into a more conscious system. Automatic habits lose their dominance, and thoughtful reflection becomes the guiding force behind decisions. The person begins living with greater mental clarity because their thoughts are no longer invisible drivers of behavior. Instead, they are observed, understood, and gently reshaped. This transformation does not require dramatic effort or sudden breakthroughs. It unfolds through quiet observation repeated day after day. As awareness continues revealing mental habits, the mind slowly becomes a place of understanding rather than confusion, allowing clearer thinking to guide the direction of life. Chapter 5. Questioning your automatic beliefs. Many beliefs operate quietly in the background of the mind. They appear so familiar that people rarely pause to examine them. A person may believe they are not capable enough, that opportunities are limited, or that certain dreams are unrealistic. These beliefs often feel permanent, Yet many of them were formed automatically through repeated experiences or observations. The mind collects impressions from childhood, education, conversations, and emotional events. Over time, those impressions solidify into beliefs that guide decisions without conscious awareness. Questioning automatic beliefs begins with the realization that many of them were accepted without deliberate evaluation. When someone starts observing their thinking carefully, they notice how frequently the same conclusions appear before a situation has even unfolded. Instead of seeing each moment clearly, the mind filters it through old assumptions. Recognizing this pattern allows a person to pause and ask whether the belief guiding their reaction is truly accurate or simply familiar. Automatic beliefs often disguise themselves as common sense. A thought may appear logical simply because it has been repeated many times, yet repetition does not always equal truth. For example, someone who has faced repeated setbacks might begin believing that failure is part of their identity. That belief shapes how they approach every new opportunity. Before even trying, they anticipate disappointment. The belief quietly shapes expectations, and those expectations influence effort and persistence. Questioning this pattern requires a willingness to examine the evidence behind the belief. When someone asks how the belief originally formed, they may realize it was built from a few specific experiences rather than an objective understanding of their potential. This awareness introduces a new perspective. Instead of accepting the belief as a permanent reality, the person begins seeing it as a mental conclusion that can be reconsidered and adjusted through new experiences. The mind naturally prefers certainty. Once a belief forms, it often resists change because stability feels reassuring. Questioning beliefs therefore requires courage and patience. When a person challenges a familiar belief, the mind may respond with discomfort. It may quickly search for examples that support the old conclusion. This reaction is part of the brain's tendency to protect established patterns. However, questioning does not mean rejecting every belief immediately. It simply means exploring whether the belief truly reflects reality or whether it limits growth. By calmly examining the origins and accuracy of a belief, the person begins loosening its automatic control over their thinking. The belief may still appear occasionally, but it no longer dictates every decision without reflection. Many automatic beliefs revolve around personal identity. People often develop strong assumptions about who they are and what they can accomplish. These assumptions may sound like statements of fact. I am not creative. I am not good with people. Or, I always struggle with discipline. Such beliefs shape behavior in subtle ways. If someone believes they lack creativity, they may avoid creative challenges entirely. If they believe they lack discipline, they may not even attempt to build consistent habits. Questioning these beliefs involves observing how they influence behavior. When a person sees that their actions are shaped by assumptions rather than evidence, curiosity begins replacing certainty. Instead of saying, "This is who I am," they begin asking, "Is this belief actually accurate?" That question opens the possibility that identity is more flexible than previously assumed. Another important step in questioning beliefs is examining the environment where they formed. Many beliefs originate from external influences rather than personal discovery. Teachers, family members, cultural expectations, and social comparisons all contribute to shaping the mind's conclusions. A child who hears criticism repeatedly may begin believing they are incapable. A student who struggles with one subject may conclude that learning itself is difficult for them. These beliefs may persist long after the original circumstances have changed. By reflecting on where a belief came from, a person may recognize that it was never fully tested. It was simply absorbed from the environment. This realization weakens the sense of inevitability that often surrounds automatic beliefs. The person begins seeing them as learned patterns rather than permanent truths. Questioning beliefs also requires examining how they affect emotional responses. When a belief remains unchallenged, it can create predictable emotional patterns. Someone who believes they are constantly judged by others may feel anxious in social situations. Someone who believes success is unattainable may feel discouraged before even beginning a project. These emotional reactions reinforce the belief, creating a cycle that strengthens the original assumption. Awareness interrupts this cycle by identifying the belief behind the emotion. Instead of assuming the emotion reflects reality, the person begins asking what belief produced it. This inquiry shifts attention from the feeling itself to the thought pattern that generated it. Once the belief becomes visible, it becomes possible to evaluate whether it deserves continued influence over future decisions. Questioning automatic beliefs often reveals how selective the mind can be with evidence. When someone believes something strongly, they tend to notice events that support the belief while ignoring those that contradict it. This mental habit reinforces existing assumptions and makes them appear more accurate than they truly are. A person who believes they are unlucky may focus on every setback while overlooking moments of progress or opportunity. Recognizing this selective attention allows a person to examine reality more objectively. By intentionally noticing experiences that contradict limiting beliefs, they begin expanding their perspective. Gradually, the mind learns that reality is more complex than the narrow conclusion it once accepted. When people begin questioning their beliefs, they sometimes worry that uncertainty will weaken their confidence. In reality, thoughtful questioning often strengthens confidence because it replaces rigid assumptions with clearer understanding. Confidence that grows from reflection is more stable than confidence built on unexamined beliefs. A person who understands why they believe something can adapt their thinking when new information appears. Instead of feeling threatened by change, they view it as part of learning. This flexibility creates resilience. The mind becomes capable of evolving rather than defending outdated assumptions. The process of questioning beliefs does not require dramatic confrontation with every thought. It often begins with small moments of curiosity. When a familiar belief appears, the person pauses and asks whether it is based on evidence or habit. They might consider alternative explanations or test the belief through new experiences. Each time the belief is examined, its automatic power decreases slightly. The mind gradually learns that questioning does not destroy stability. Instead, it refines understanding. Through repeated reflection, beliefs become more balanced and realistic. Another valuable outcome of questioning beliefs is the development of intellectual humility. When someone recognizes how many of their assumptions were formed automatically, they become more open to learning. They understand that certainty can sometimes be misleading. This openness encourages deeper exploration of ideas and perspectives. Instead of clinging rigidly to old conclusions, the mind becomes willing to update its understanding when new information appears. This flexibility is a sign of mental maturity rather than weakness. It allows a person to grow without feeling threatened by the possibility of being wrong. Over time, the practice of questioning beliefs transforms the way the mind approaches challenges. Instead of immediately assuming limitations, the person begins exploring possibilities. They ask, what might be possible if the belief guiding their hesitation is not entirely accurate? This shift encourages experimentation and learning. Each new experience provides evidence that helps refine understanding. Gradually, the mind replaces rigid assumptions with thoughtful perspectives shaped by observation and reflection. When automatic beliefs are questioned regularly, the mind becomes more intentional in its thinking. Old assumptions lose their invisible authority, and new insights begin guiding decisions. Instead of repeating conclusions that were accepted years ago, the person builds beliefs based on current understanding and experience. This transformation does not eliminate uncertainty, but it replaces unconscious patterns with conscious reasoning. The mind becomes less reactive and more reflective. Through consistent questioning, beliefs evolve into tools for understanding rather than barriers that limit possibility. Chapter 6. Letting go of limiting thoughts. Many thoughts that live inside the mind feel permanent simply because they have been repeated for years. A person may carry quiet statements within themselves such as, "I am not capable," "This will never work," or "People like me cannot succeed." These thoughts slowly become invisible rules guiding decisions. They influence how a person sees opportunities, how they interpret challenges, and how much effort they are willing to invest in their goals. Yet limiting thoughts are not permanent truths. They are mental patterns that formed through repetition and experience. Letting go of them begins with recognizing that they were learned, not born with us. The mind absorbs ideas from past events, from other people's opinions, and from moments of fear or disappointment. Once the person realizes that these thoughts were constructed over time, they begin to understand that those same thoughts can also be released and replaced with more constructive perspectives. Limiting thoughts often appear convincing because they protect the mind from uncertainty. When someone believes they cannot achieve something, they no longer need to face the discomfort of trying and possibly failing. The belief quietly creates a psychological shield. While this shield may feel protective, it also prevents growth. Letting go of limiting thoughts means accepting that uncertainty is part of progress. It requires a willingness to step beyond the familiar boundaries created by those beliefs. When a person begins questioning the thoughts that once defined their limits, they discover that many of those limits were never real barriers. They were interpretations shaped by past experiences. As the mind gradually releases these interpretations, new possibilities become visible. The person begins seeing opportunities that were previously hidden behind the belief that success was unattainable. The mind tends to hold tightly to thoughts that have strong emotional memories attached to them. If someone experienced rejection or failure in the past, the mind may repeatedly remind them of that moment as a warning. The thought appears whenever a similar situation arises, encouraging caution or avoidance. Letting go of limiting thoughts requires understanding that past experiences do not permanently define future outcomes. Memories are valuable teachers, but they do not have to become lifelong restrictions. By acknowledging the lesson within an experience, without allowing it to become a defining belief, a person creates mental flexibility. Instead of viewing the past as proof of limitation, they begin seeing it as information that can guide wiser decisions moving forward. Another challenge in releasing limiting thoughts is that they often feel connected to personal identity. A person may have spent years describing themselves with certain labels, such as shy, unlucky, or incapable. Over time, these labels feel like accurate descriptions rather than interpretations. Letting go of limiting thoughts requires separating identity from past patterns. A person is not defined by the thoughts that once dominated their mind. Identity is shaped through continuous learning and adaptation. When someone realizes that their thinking has changed many times throughout life, they begin understanding that identity itself is flexible. Releasing a limiting belief does not mean abandoning who they are. It simply means allowing a more accurate and expansive understanding of themselves to develop. Letting go of limiting thoughts also requires observing how frequently they appear during daily life. Many people underestimate how often the same discouraging ideas repeat in their minds. A moment of hesitation before speaking, a doubt before starting a new task, or a quiet assumption that success belongs to others rather than themselves. These thoughts may appear small, but when they repeat frequently, they influence behavior. Awareness allows a person to notice these patterns as they happen. Instead of automatically believing the thought, they begin questioning its usefulness. Each time the thought is observed rather than followed, its influence weakens slightly. Gradually, the mind becomes less dominated by those limiting patterns. Replacing limiting thoughts does not mean forcing unrealistic positivity. Genuine mental change comes from balanced thinking rather than denial of challenges. When a limiting thought appears, the goal is not to pretend that difficulty does not exist. Instead, the person examines whether the thought accurately reflects the situation. For example, the thought, "I will definitely fail," may be replaced with a more balanced perspective such as, "This may be difficult, but I can learn and improve." This shift does not ignore reality, it simply removes the unnecessary certainty of failure. Balanced thinking allows effort and growth to continue without being blocked by exaggerated negative conclusions. Environment also plays a role in maintaining or releasing limiting thoughts. When a person spends time in environments where negativity and doubt dominate conversations, those attitudes can reinforce existing beliefs. The mind absorbs the perspectives it hears most often. Letting go of limiting thoughts sometimes requires exposure to new influences that encourage growth and possibility. Reading new ideas, listening to different perspectives, or surrounding oneself with individuals who believe in development can gradually reshape the mental environment. As the mind encounters new viewpoints, old assumptions lose their sense of inevitability. The person begins realizing that thinking differently is not only possible, but common among those who pursue progress. Letting go of limiting thoughts also involves patience. Mental habits formed over years do not disappear instantly. Even after someone decides to release a particular belief, the old thought may continue appearing for some time. This does not mean the effort is failing. It simply means the brain is repeating a pattern it practiced frequently in the past. Each time the thought appears and is recognized rather than believed, the mind weakens its influence. Over time, the brain forms new pathways that support more constructive thinking. Patience allows the process of change to unfold naturally, without frustration. As limiting thoughts begin losing their power, a person often notices subtle changes in behavior. They may become more willing to try unfamiliar tasks, to express ideas more openly, or to continue working despite temporary setbacks. These changes may seem small at first, but they represent a shift in the relationship between thought and action. The mind is no longer dominated by the assumption that failure or limitation is inevitable. Instead, it begins exploring possibilities with curiosity and persistence. The person gradually becomes more resilient, because their thinking supports effort rather than discouraging it. Confidence grows naturally when limiting thoughts are released. Many people believe confidence comes from external achievements, but in reality it often begins with internal beliefs. When the mind stops repeating constant doubts, it creates space for a more balanced perspective. The person begins recognizing their ability to learn, adapt, and improve through effort. Confidence then becomes a result of experience rather than an imagined state. Each action taken without the interference of limiting beliefs provides evidence that progress is possible. Over time, the mind becomes quieter and more supportive when limiting thoughts are replaced with constructive ones. Decisions are made with greater clarity because the person is no longer battling internal resistance at every step. Challenges still exist, but they are approached with curiosity rather than defeat. The mental energy once spent defending limiting beliefs becomes available for learning and creativity. Life begins to feel less restricted because the barriers once created by thought patterns have been removed. Letting go of limiting thoughts ultimately leads to a deeper sense of mental freedom. The person realizes that thoughts are not commands, but interpretations that can be examined and adjusted. When the mind no longer clings to outdated conclusions, it becomes capable of seeing the world with greater openness. Opportunities that once seemed impossible begin appearing within reach. The individual discovers that the boundaries that once defined their life were often built from repeated ideas rather than real limitations. With those ideas released, the path forward becomes wider and clearer than it ever appeared before. Chapter 7. Replacing old thinking with clear logic. Many people attempt to change their lives by motivating themselves emotionally, yet emotions alone rarely sustain long-term transformation. The mind needs something steadier than temporary inspiration. This is where clear logic becomes powerful. Logic does not depend on mood, fear, or excitement. It examines situations carefully and asks what conclusion is actually supported by evidence. When old thinking patterns are built on assumptions or emotional reactions, replacing them with logical reasoning begins reshaping the mind. A person who once believed, "I always fail," may start examining that thought with logic instead of emotion. They might notice moments of improvement, skills they have developed, and problems they have solved before. Logic reveals that the original belief was exaggerated. The mind slowly shifts from reacting automatically to evaluating thoughtfully. Over time, decisions become guided by reasoning rather than by habits formed during moments of doubt or fear. Old thinking often survives because it feels convincing rather than because it is accurate. The mind may quickly interpret a mistake as proof of incompetence or a delay as proof of failure. These interpretations appear logical at first glance, but they are often conclusions formed without careful analysis. Clear logic requires examining the situation more patiently. Instead of accepting the first explanation that appears, the mind begins asking questions. What actually happened? What factors influenced the outcome? What evidence supports the conclusion I am making? This process slows down automatic thinking. When the mind takes time to analyze instead of reacting instantly, it begins noticing details that were previously ignored. Logic replaces exaggerated assumptions with balanced understanding. As a result, thoughts become less dramatic and more accurate. This accuracy gradually reshapes the way a person interprets challenges and opportunities. One of the strongest benefits of logical thinking is its ability to separate facts from interpretations. Many old mental patterns mix these two elements together. For example, failing a test is a fact. Concluding that one is incapable of learning is an interpretation. The mind often blends the two until the interpretation feels like a permanent truth. Clear logic carefully separates what actually happened from the story built around it. When a person learns to make this distinction, many limiting beliefs begin losing their authority. They realize that facts rarely carry the harsh conclusions the mind attaches to them. This clarity creates a more accurate picture of reality. Instead of reacting emotionally to interpretations, the person begins working with the facts themselves, which often reveal opportunities for improvement that were previously hidden behind pessimistic assumptions. Logical thinking also helps a person evaluate risk more realistically. Fear often exaggerates potential danger, convincing the mind that failure would be catastrophic. Logic introduces perspective by analyzing probabilities and outcomes more calmly. When a person asks what the actual consequences of failure would be, the answer is often less severe than the mind initially imagined. Most mistakes lead to learning rather than permanent loss. Understanding this logically reduces unnecessary hesitation. The person becomes more willing to experiment and try new approaches because they recognize that the worst possible outcome is rarely as devastating as fear suggests. Logic, therefore, reduces the emotional weight attached to challenges and encourages a more balanced approach to decision-making. Replacing old thinking with clear logic also improves how the mind processes criticism. Without logical evaluation, criticism can easily trigger defensive reactions. A person may assume they are being attacked or misunderstood. Logic encourages a different approach. Instead of reacting immediately, the mind analyzes whether the criticism contains useful information. Some feedback may indeed be unfair, but other parts may highlight areas that can be improved. Logical reasoning allows a person to extract value from criticism without allowing it to damage their confidence. The focus shifts from emotional reaction to practical evaluation. This ability transforms criticism into a tool for growth rather than a source of discouragement. The mind also benefits from logic when interpreting success and failure. Emotional thinking often creates extreme conclusions. A small success may lead to overconfidence, while a temporary failure may lead to deep discouragement. Logic balances these reactions by examining outcomes more carefully. A success may be the result of preparation and effort, but it may also involve favorable circumstances. A failure may reveal mistakes that can be corrected rather than proof of inability. Logical thinking keeps the mind grounded. Instead of swinging between extremes, it maintains a steady perspective that focuses on learning and improvement. Another advantage of logical thinking is its ability to organize complex problems. When challenges appear overwhelming, the mind may react with confusion or avoidance. Logic encourages breaking the problem into smaller parts. Each part can be examined individually and addressed step by step. This structured approach reduces the emotional pressure that often accompanies large challenges. The person realizes that progress does not require solving everything at once. Instead, consistent reasoning and small actions gradually lead to meaningful improvement. Logic transforms overwhelming problems into manageable tasks. Replacing old thinking patterns also requires recognizing how quickly the mind forms conclusions. Many automatic thoughts are based on limited information. A single event may lead to a sweeping generalization about the future. Logical thinking challenges this habit by asking whether enough evidence exists to support the conclusion. Often the answer is no. The mind begins recognizing that many assumptions were formed prematurely. This awareness encourages patience and careful observation before reaching judgments. As a result, thinking becomes more thoughtful and less reactive. Clear logic also encourages intellectual honesty. Instead of defending familiar beliefs simply because they are comfortable, the mind becomes willing to adjust its conclusions when new information appears. This flexibility strengthens understanding. When a person is willing to admit when a belief is incomplete or incorrect, they open the door to deeper learning. Logical thinking values accuracy more than pride. This attitude allows the mind to evolve continuously rather than becoming rigidly attached to outdated ideas. Over time, practicing logical thinking strengthens mental discipline. The mind becomes less influenced by sudden emotions or impulsive interpretations. Instead, it develops the habit of evaluating situations carefully before reacting. This discipline improves decision-making in every area of life. Whether facing professional challenges, personal conflicts, or long-term goals, the person approaches situations with clarity rather than confusion. Logical reasoning becomes a stable guide that prevents the mind from drifting back into automatic patterns of thinking. Replacing old thinking with clear logic does not remove emotion from life. Emotions still provide valuable signals about what matters to us. However, logic ensures that emotions do not control decisions without reflection. When both reasoning and emotion work together, the mind becomes balanced. Feelings provide motivation, while logic provides direction. This combination allows a person to pursue goals with both passion and clarity. As logical thinking becomes a regular habit, the mind gradually releases many of its outdated assumptions. Decisions are no longer driven by fears that were never examined or beliefs that were never tested. Instead, choices are guided by thoughtful reasoning supported by evidence and experience. This shift creates a more stable mental foundation. The person becomes capable of navigating uncertainty with confidence because their thinking is grounded in clarity rather than reaction. Over time, logic transforms the mind into a reliable guide for growth, learning, and purposeful action. Chapter 8. Attention rewrites mental patterns. Attention is one of the most powerful forces shaping the human mind, yet most people rarely notice how it works. Wherever attention repeatedly goes, the mind slowly builds stronger patterns. Thoughts that receive attention grow familiar, while thoughts that are ignored gradually fade. This quiet process happens every day. If a person constantly focuses on worries, the mind becomes skilled at producing more worries. If attention often moves toward learning, problem-solving, and improvement, the mind begins strengthening those patterns instead. Attention acts like a spotlight inside the brain. It illuminates certain thoughts while leaving others in the dark. Over time, the thoughts receiving the most light become the dominant pathways guiding behavior. Understanding this process reveals something important. The mind is not only shaped by experiences, but also by what a person chooses to notice repeatedly. Attention, therefore, becomes a tool capable of gradually rewriting mental habits. Many people assume that their thoughts simply appear beyond their control. While it is true that thoughts arise automatically, attention determines which ones remain active. When a thought appears, the mind has a choice. It can follow the thought and feed it with more attention, or it can allow the thought to pass without engagement. Repeatedly choosing where attention goes gradually changes the mental landscape. For example, when a discouraging thought appears and a person immediately begins analyzing it, the brain strengthens that pathway. But if the person shifts attention toward a constructive task or a practical solution, the discouraging thought receives less reinforcement. Over time, the brain becomes less likely to produce it frequently. Attention, therefore, works like a form of mental practice. The thoughts that receive attention become stronger through repetition, while the thoughts that are ignored slowly weaken. Mental patterns often feel permanent because they have been practiced unconsciously for years. A person may have spent a long time focusing on doubt, criticism, or fear without realizing how consistently their attention returned to those themes. Each moment of attention strengthened the same neural pathways. Changing these patterns does not require forcing the mind to stop thinking entirely. Instead, it requires redirecting attention toward thoughts and activities that support growth. When attention repeatedly focuses on problem-solving, learning, and constructive reflection, the brain begins strengthening those pathways. Gradually, the mind becomes more comfortable producing those types of thoughts. This transformation does not happen instantly, but attention applied consistently becomes a quiet force reshaping the direction of thinking. One of the most common places where attention influences mental patterns is in how people respond to mistakes. When someone focuses intensely on the embarrassment or frustration of a mistake, their mind learns to associate errors with emotional discomfort. This attention strengthens anxiety around future challenges. However, when attention shifts toward understanding what can be learned from the mistake, the brain begins associating errors with improvement rather than shame. The same event leads to completely different mental patterns depending on where attention is directed. By focusing on learning rather than self-criticism, a person trains the mind to approach challenges with curiosity rather than fear. Attention also influences how the mind processes daily experiences. Two people may encounter the same situation but focus on different aspects of it. One person might notice problems and inconveniences, while another focuses on opportunities and solutions. These differences in attention gradually shape the way each person thinks about life. Over time, the mind becomes more skilled at producing the types of thoughts it practices most often. When attention frequently highlights obstacles, the mind becomes efficient at detecting difficulties. When attention regularly searches for possibilities, the mind becomes better at recognizing opportunities. The environment itself may remain unchanged, but the mental patterns interpreting that environment evolve according to where attention consistently rests. Modern life often pulls attention in many directions at once. Constant information, distractions, and rapid communication make it easy for attention to become scattered. When attention is fragmented, the mind struggles to develop strong, constructive patterns. Thoughts appear and disappear quickly without deep reflection. Learning and insight require sustained attention. When a person practices focusing deeply on a task or idea, the brain strengthens the neural connections associated with that activity. This focused attention gradually builds mental clarity and discipline. Instead of reacting to every distraction, the mind learns to remain engaged with meaningful thoughts for longer periods. Over time, this ability creates stronger mental patterns centered around concentration and understanding. Another important effect of attention appears in emotional regulation. Emotions often intensify when attention repeatedly returns to the same distressing thought. The more a person analyzes a negative memory or imagined problem, the more powerful the emotional response becomes. Redirecting attention toward constructive action or present experiences can reduce this emotional amplification. This does not mean ignoring genuine problems, but it means choosing when and how much attention to give them. When attention is used deliberately, the mind becomes less overwhelmed by repetitive emotional loops. Instead, it begins prioritizing thoughts that lead towards solutions or meaningful activity. Attention also influences motivation. When someone constantly focuses on how far they are from their goals, discouragement may grow stronger. The mind interprets the distance as evidence that progress is difficult. However, when attention highlights small improvements and completed steps, motivation increases. The brain begins recognizing that progress is happening, even if it is gradual. By intentionally noticing signs of improvement, a person trains the mind to associate effort with positive outcomes. This pattern strengthens persistence because the mind begins expecting progress rather than defeat. The process of rewriting mental patterns through attention requires consistency. Occasional shifts in attention are helpful, but lasting change occurs when new patterns are practiced repeatedly. Each time attention returns to constructive thinking, the brain reinforces that pathway slightly. Over weeks and months, the accumulated effect becomes significant. Thoughts that once appeared automatically begin appearing less frequently, while new perspectives become more natural. This gradual rewiring reflects the brain's capacity to adapt through repeated mental focus. Attention also determines how deeply a person understands their own thinking. When someone regularly observes their thoughts with curiosity, they begin recognizing patterns that were previously invisible. This awareness allows them to choose where attention should go next. Instead of reacting automatically, they become active participants in shaping their mental habits. The mind becomes less chaotic and more organized because attention is guiding its development intentionally. The ability to direct attention improves with practice. At first, the mind may wander frequently because it has been accustomed to following every thought that appears. With patience, the person learns to gently bring attention back to the chosen focus. Each time this happens, the brain strengthens the ability to concentrate. Over time, attention becomes steadier and more deliberate. The person gains greater influence over the thoughts that dominate their mind. When attention is used intentionally, it becomes one of the most powerful tools for mental transformation. Instead of allowing old patterns to repeat automatically, a person gradually replaces them with patterns shaped by thoughtful focus. The mind begins reflecting the direction of attention rather than the weight of past habits. Through consistent practice, attention quietly rewrites the pathways of thought, allowing clearer, more constructive thinking to guide the course of daily life. Chapter 9. Discipline strengthens a new mindset. Many people believe a new mindset appears suddenly after motivation or inspiration. They imagine that once they understand a powerful idea, their thinking will automatically change. In reality, A mindset becomes strong only when it is practiced repeatedly through discipline. Discipline is the bridge between understanding and transformation. When a person decides to think differently, the mind may still return to old patterns out of habit. Discipline ensures that the new perspective continues even when the old thoughts attempt to return. It is the quiet commitment to repeat constructive thinking day after day. Each time the person chooses patience instead of frustration, logic instead of doubt, or effort instead of avoidance, the new mindset becomes stronger. Discipline is not dramatic. It is a steady force that trains the mind through consistent practice until the new way of thinking feels natural. The mind behaves like a system that learns through repetition. If someone wants to replace discouraging thoughts with constructive reasoning, they must practice that reasoning consistently. A single moment of clarity is not enough. Old habits were formed through thousands of repetitions, so new patterns must be reinforced through similar persistence. Discipline ensures that the new mindset is practiced even on difficult days when motivation is absent. When the mind begins slipping back toward familiar negative assumptions, discipline gently redirects it toward balanced thinking. Over time, the brain begins recognizing the new pattern as the default response. What once required effort gradually becomes automatic. The person no longer struggles to think constructively because the disciplined repetition has strengthened the new pathway. Discipline also helps protect the mind from emotional reactions that could weaken the new mindset. When challenges appear, emotions can quickly influence thinking. Frustration, fear, or disappointment may encourage the mind to return to old conclusions. Discipline acts as a stabilizing force during these moments. Instead of reacting impulsively, the person follows the principles they have chosen to practice. They remind themselves that temporary setbacks do not erase progress. They continue applying logic and patience even when the situation feels uncomfortable. Each time discipline prevents an emotional reaction from dominating the mind, the new mindset gains strength. A new mindset often begins with small choices repeated throughout daily life. Discipline transforms these small choices into lasting habits. For example, a person trying to develop resilience may choose to analyze problems calmly instead of complaining. At first, this response may feel unnatural. The mind may prefer its old habit of reacting quickly. Discipline encourages the person to repeat the calm response anyway. With time, the brain begins recognizing this reaction as normal. The habit strengthens because discipline maintained it long enough for the mind to adapt. Eventually, resilience becomes part of the person's natural thinking rather than a forced effort. Discipline also requires clarity about what mindset is being strengthened. Without clear direction, the mind can easily drift between different attitudes depending on circumstances. When a person defines the principles guiding their thinking, discipline becomes easier to maintain. They may decide that their mindset will prioritize learning, patience, and responsibility. These principles act as a mental compass. When confusion or stress appears, discipline encourages the person to return to those guiding ideas. Instead of reacting randomly, the mind follows a consistent direction. This consistency gradually shapes the way the person interprets experiences and responds to challenges. Another important role of discipline is maintaining focus during long periods of progress. Mental transformation rarely happens quickly. Many improvements unfold slowly over months or years. During this time, the mind may become impatient or discouraged. Discipline reminds the person that progress often occurs gradually. Instead of expecting immediate results, they continue practicing constructive thinking with patience. Each day of disciplined effort adds another layer of strength to the new mindset. The cumulative effect becomes visible over time as decisions become clearer and reactions become more balanced. Discipline also influences how a person responds to distractions. Modern life constantly presents opportunities to lose focus or abandon long-term goals. Without discipline, the mind may follow every new impulse or temporary desire. When discipline is present, the person remembers the mindset they are building. They recognize that short-term distractions can weaken the patterns they are trying to strengthen. Instead of reacting automatically, they consciously choose actions that support their long-term thinking. Each time discipline guides attention back toward meaningful goals, the mind becomes more stable and intentional. Another important benefit of discipline is the development of trust in oneself. When a person repeatedly follows through on their chosen mindset, they begin trusting their ability to maintain consistency. This trust creates confidence. The person realizes that they are capable of guiding their thinking rather than being controlled by circumstances. Discipline builds this confidence gradually because each disciplined action becomes evidence of reliability. The mind begins expecting constructive responses instead of fearing emotional reactions. Discipline also reduces the influence of temporary moods on thinking. Everyone experiences moments of low energy or discouragement. Without discipline, these moods can easily dictate decisions and actions. When discipline is strong, the person continues practicing constructive thinking even when they do not feel motivated. They understand that feelings are temporary while habits shape long-term outcomes. By continuing their mental practices regardless of mood, they strengthen the stability of their mindset. The development of discipline often begins with small commitments that are easy to maintain. A person may decide to spend a few minutes each day reflecting on their thinking or reviewing the lessons they want to practice. These small actions may seem simple, but they gradually train the mind to remain attentive to its patterns. Discipline grows stronger when these actions become part of daily routine. The brain learns that reflection and intentional thinking are normal parts of life rather than occasional efforts. As discipline continues strengthening the new mindset, the person begins noticing subtle changes in behavior. They may react more calmly during stressful situations, remain focused on long-term goals, and approach challenges with curiosity rather than fear. These changes indicate that the disciplined practice of new thinking has begun reshaping the brain. The mindset is no longer something they are trying to maintain. It has become part of their natural perspective. Ultimately, discipline transforms intention into reality. Understanding a new way of thinking is only the first step. The real transformation occurs when that understanding is practiced consistently until it becomes a habit. Discipline provides the steady repetition necessary for this transformation. Through patient effort and consistent practice, the new mindset becomes stronger than the old patterns that once controlled the mind. Over time, disciplined thinking turns clarity into action and action into lasting change. Chapter 10. Small changes transform thinking. Change rarely begins with dramatic moments. More often, it starts quietly through small adjustments in the way a person thinks and responds to everyday situations. Many people wait for a powerful breakthrough before believing transformation is possible. Yet the mind evolves through gradual steps rather than sudden leaps. A single new habit of thinking may appear insignificant at first, but when it is repeated consistently, it begins reshaping mental patterns. Just as a river slowly carves its path through stone, small changes in thinking gradually alter the direction of the mind. A person who once reacted with frustration may begin pausing for a moment before responding. Another who once avoided challenges might start attempting small tasks they previously ignored. These changes appear modest, yet they quietly build momentum. Over time, the accumulation of these small adjustments leads to a mindset that feels entirely different from the one that existed before. The mind is shaped by repetition more than by intensity. A person does not need to force dramatic new thoughts into their mind every day. Instead, steady improvement often begins with simple shifts in perspective. For example, someone who used to think, "This is impossible," may begin saying, "This will take time, but I can learn." The difference between these thoughts may seem small, yet the impact becomes significant over time. The second thought encourages patience and persistence, while the first one encourages avoidance. Each time the new perspective is practiced, the brain strengthens the mental pathway associated with it. Gradually, the constructive thought begins appearing more naturally. What once required conscious effort slowly becomes the mind's automatic response. Small changes also reduce the pressure that often prevents people from improving their thinking. When someone believes they must transform completely overnight, the task feels overwhelming. The mind becomes discouraged before progress even begins. By focusing on small changes instead, improvement becomes manageable. A person may choose to replace one negative reaction each day with a more thoughtful response. They may begin observing their thoughts for a few minutes every morning. These small actions require little effort, yet they gradually strengthen awareness and clarity. Over weeks and months, the repeated practice accumulates into noticeable mental growth. Many mental habits persist simply because they have never been challenged in small ways. If someone constantly criticizes themselves after making a mistake, that reaction becomes familiar and automatic. Changing this habit does not require eliminating self-criticism completely at once. Instead, the person may begin by adding a second thought after the criticism appears. They might say, "I made a mistake, but I can improve." This small adjustment introduces balance into the thinking process. With repetition, the constructive response becomes stronger, and the harsh criticism gradually loses its influence. The change begins with a single additional thought, yet its long-term impact reshapes the person's self-perception. Small changes in thinking often create noticeable changes in behavior. When the mind begins interpreting challenges as opportunities to learn, actions naturally follow that perspective. A person who once avoided difficult tasks may begin approaching them with curiosity. The task itself has not changed, but the thinking behind it has shifted slightly. This shift encourages experimentation and persistence. Over time, repeated attempts lead to improved skill and confidence. The individual begins seeing evidence that the new way of thinking is effective. This evidence reinforces the mental change, making it easier to maintain. Another example of small mental change appears in how people interpret daily events. A person might normally focus on problems that arise throughout the day. By intentionally noticing moments of progress or cooperation, they introduce a new pattern of attention. This change does not deny the existence of problems. It simply balances the mind's perspective by recognizing positive elements as well. Gradually, the brain becomes accustomed to observing both difficulties and improvements. The overall mental outlook becomes more balanced and realistic. This shift begins with a simple decision to notice details that were previously ignored. Small improvements in thinking also strengthen emotional stability. When a person practices responding calmly to minor frustrations, they train the mind to remain composed during larger challenges. Each small moment of patience becomes practice for greater resilience. The brain learns that reacting calmly is possible even in uncomfortable situations. Over time, this habit becomes part of the person's natural response to stress. What once triggered immediate irritation now invites thoughtful reflection instead. The change began with small adjustments in everyday situations, yet it gradually strengthened emotional control. Consistency is what gives small changes their transformative power. A single constructive thought may not immediately alter the mind's patterns. However, repeating that thought every day gradually strengthens its influence. Each repetition adds a small amount of reinforcement to the new mental pathway. Over time, the accumulated effect becomes substantial. The brain adapts to the pattern that receives the most consistent attention. By practicing small improvements regularly, a person gradually rewires their thinking without needing dramatic effort. Another advantage of small changes is that they allow the mind to adapt comfortably. Large changes often trigger resistance because they feel unfamiliar or overwhelming. Small adjustments, however, feel manageable. The brain accepts them more easily because they do not threaten the existing structure of thinking. As these small changes accumulate, they gradually shift the overall mindset. The transformation occurs so naturally that the person may not notice it immediately. One day they realize that their reactions, decisions, and expectations have quietly improved. Small changes also help build confidence. When a person notices that their thinking has improved even slightly, they begin trusting their ability to continue growing. Each small success becomes evidence that transformation is possible. This confidence encourages further effort. The person becomes motivated not by sudden inspiration, but by the steady recognition that improvement is happening. Confidence built through small progress tends to be more stable because it is supported by repeated experience rather than temporary enthusiasm. Over time, the accumulation of small mental adjustments begins influencing every aspect of life. Decisions become more thoughtful because the mind has practiced careful evaluation. Challenges become less intimidating because the person has repeatedly chosen persistence over avoidance. Relationships improve because reactions become calmer and more understanding. Each improvement traces back to small changes that were practiced consistently. The transformation may appear gradual, but its long-term impact becomes profound. When people understand the power of small changes, they stop waiting for dramatic breakthroughs. They realize that transformation is built step by step through everyday thinking. Each moment offers an opportunity to practice a slightly better response, a slightly clearer perspective, or a slightly more constructive thought. These small improvements accumulate until the mind begins operating with greater clarity and strength. In this way, the quiet repetition of small changes gradually transforms the entire direction of a person's thinking. Chapter 11. Confidence comes from mental clarity. Confidence is often misunderstood as a loud feeling of certainty or boldness. Many people imagine confident individuals as those who never doubt themselves and who always move forward without hesitation. In reality, true confidence rarely begins with loud emotion. It grows quietly from mental clarity. When the mind understands a situation clearly, decisions become easier to make. Doubt loses its power because confusion fades. A person who sees things clearly does not need to force confidence. It naturally appears as a result of understanding. When someone knows why they are taking an action and what they are trying to achieve, they move forward with steadiness. Confidence then becomes less about personality and more about clarity of thought. The clearer the mind becomes, the less room there is for unnecessary hesitation. Confidence grows as the mind learns to interpret situations accurately instead of reacting to vague fears or assumptions. Many people struggle with confidence because their thinking is crowded with conflicting ideas. One thought encourages action, while another warns against risk. One belief suggests progress is possible, while another insists failure is inevitable. This inner conflict creates uncertainty. The person does not lack ability, but their mind lacks clarity. When thinking becomes disorganized, confidence naturally weakens. Mental clarity removes this conflict by organizing thoughts around realistic understanding. Instead of listening to every random doubt that appears, the mind learns to evaluate thoughts carefully. It identifies which ideas are supported by evidence and which ones are simply habits of fear. As unnecessary thoughts fade away, the remaining reasoning becomes stronger. This clarity simplifies decision-making and allows the person to move forward with greater stability. Confidence built on clarity is different from confidence built on temporary motivation. Motivation often fades when challenges appear, but clarity remains steady. A person who understands the reasons behind their actions does not depend entirely on emotional energy. They know the purpose of their effort and the logic behind their choices. This understanding helps them continue even when circumstances become difficult. When the mind recognizes that progress requires patience and persistence, setbacks no longer feel like proof of failure. They appear as natural steps within the learning process. This perspective allows confidence to remain stable even during moments of difficulty. Mental clarity also helps people understand their own strengths and limitations more realistically. Some individuals struggle with confidence because they exaggerate their weaknesses. Others become overconfident because they ignore their limitations. Both extremes arise from unclear thinking. When a person examines their abilities honestly, they develop balanced self-awareness. They recognize what they can improve and what they already do well. This balanced understanding removes unnecessary self-doubt while preventing unrealistic expectations. Confidence then grows from accurate self-knowledge rather than from illusions about perfection. Another important effect of mental clarity is the ability to distinguish between real problems and imagined ones. The mind sometimes creates fears based on possibilities that have little connection to reality. A person may worry excessively about criticism, failure, or rejection without considering how likely those outcomes actually are. Clear thinking examines these fears logically. It asks whether the danger is real or simply an exaggerated assumption. Often, the mind discovers that the situation is less threatening than it initially appeared. As imagined, dangers lose their influence, confidence increases because the person no longer feels overwhelmed by unnecessary worry. Clarity also strengthens communication and interaction with others. When a person understands their own thoughts clearly, they express themselves more effectively. They speak with purpose rather than hesitation. This ability naturally creates an impression of confidence. People respond positively to individuals who communicate with clarity because their ideas appear organized and thoughtful. The confidence seen in such individuals is not the result of trying to impress others. It is the natural outcome of a mind that has taken time to understand its own reasoning before speaking. Confidence also grows when the mind becomes less distracted by unnecessary comparisons. Many people weaken their confidence by constantly measuring themselves against others. These comparisons often ignore differences in experience, opportunity, and timing. Mental clarity recognizes that progress is personal rather than competitive. When a person focuses on their own development instead of external comparisons, they gain a clearer sense of direction. Their confidence becomes rooted in their own improvement rather than in temporary comparisons with others. The process of gaining mental clarity often begins with slowing down the speed of thinking. A mind that reacts instantly to every situation rarely has time to examine its thoughts. By pausing before responding, a person allows themselves to observe their thinking more carefully. They begin noticing which thoughts are useful and which ones create confusion. This practice gradually organizes the mind. With fewer unnecessary thoughts competing for attention, decisions become simpler. Confidence then arises from the ability to think clearly rather than from impulsive reactions. Mental clarity also improves how a person responds to criticism or feedback. When someone lacks clarity about their abilities and goals, criticism can feel threatening. The mind interprets it as an attack on identity. However, a person with clear thinking sees feedback differently. They evaluate whether the criticism contains useful information. If it does, they use it to improve. If it does not, they let it pass without unnecessary emotional reaction. This balanced response preserves confidence because the person understands their direction and values growth more than approval. As clarity increases, the mind becomes more stable during uncertain situations. Instead of reacting with panic or confusion, the person analyzes the situation calmly. They consider possible actions and their consequences before choosing a direction. This thoughtful approach creates a sense of control. Even when outcomes are uncertain, the person trusts their reasoning process. Confidence, therefore, becomes linked to the ability to think clearly under pressure, rather than to the guarantee of success. Confidence rooted in mental clarity also encourages long-term commitment to goals. When someone clearly understands why a goal matters to them, their motivation becomes deeper. They are not simply chasing temporary excitement or external approval. Their actions align with personal values and understanding. This alignment strengthens determination because the person knows the purpose behind their effort. Challenges may slow progress, but they do not erase the clarity guiding the journey. Over time, mental clarity transforms the way a person experiences life. Decisions feel less overwhelming because the mind evaluates them logically. Doubt appears less frequently because the person understands their reasoning. Confidence grows quietly from this steady understanding. It is not a loud declaration of superiority, but a calm assurance that the mind is capable of learning, adapting, and moving forward. In this way, confidence becomes the natural result of a mind that sees itself and the world with clarity. Chapter 12. Building a stronger way of thinking. Building a stronger way of thinking does not begin with grand ideas or dramatic changes. It begins with a simple realization that the mind can be trained just like any other skill. Many people assume that their thinking is fixed, that the way they interpret the world today will remain the same forever. Yet the mind is constantly adapting. Every experience, every reflection, and every repeated thought contributes to shaping its structure. When someone decides to strengthen their thinking, they begin guiding this natural process instead of letting it happen randomly. They start choosing the thoughts that deserve attention and quietly letting go of those that weaken clarity. Over time, this deliberate approach changes how the mind processes challenges, opportunities, and decisions. What once felt confusing or overwhelming becomes easier to understand. A stronger way of thinking develops through consistent practice, gradually replacing scattered reactions with calm reasoning. One important step in strengthening thinking is learning to pause before reacting. Many mental mistakes occur because the mind moves too quickly. A situation appears, and the mind immediately produces a judgment or conclusion. This reaction often relies on old habits rather than thoughtful understanding. When a person pauses for a moment before responding, the mind gains time to observe the situation more clearly. The pause may last only a few seconds, yet it allows reason to replace impulse. Over time, this habit of pausing strengthens thoughtful thinking. The person becomes less controlled by sudden emotions and more guided by careful reflection. The quality of decisions improves because they are no longer driven by automatic reactions. A stronger way of thinking also depends on curiosity. When the mind remains curious, it continues learning instead of settling into rigid beliefs. Curiosity encourages questions such as why something happened, what can be learned from it, and how the situation could be improved. This attitude transforms ordinary experiences into opportunities for growth. Instead of seeing problems as obstacles, the curious mind sees them as information. Each experience becomes part of a larger process of understanding. Over time, this approach expands the mind's perspective. A person who continues asking thoughtful questions gradually builds a deeper and more flexible way of thinking. Another important element is the willingness to examine one's own assumptions. Every person carries beliefs about how the world works and what is possible. Some of these beliefs are accurate, while others may have formed through misunderstanding or limited experience. Strengthening the mind requires examining these beliefs with honesty. When a person questions their assumptions, They discover which ideas truly support progress and which ones quietly limit it. This examination does not weaken thinking, it refines it. By removing outdated beliefs, the mind creates space for more accurate and constructive perspectives. Consistency plays a major role in developing strong thinking. Just as physical strength develops through regular exercise, mental strength develops through repeated practice. A person who regularly reflects on their thoughts, evaluates their decisions, and learns from experience gradually improves their mental discipline. Each day provides opportunities to practice clearer thinking. A mistake becomes a lesson, a challenge becomes an experiment, and a success becomes evidence of effective reasoning. These repeated experiences strengthen the mind's ability to analyze situations thoughtfully. Environment also influences how thinking develops. The ideas a person hears, the conversations they participate in, and the information they absorb all shape their perspective. When someone chooses environments that encourage thoughtful discussion and learning, their thinking naturally becomes stronger. Exposure to new ideas expands the mind's understanding of possibilities. Reading, observing different viewpoints, and engaging in meaningful conversations introduce perspectives that challenge narrow thinking. As the mind processes these influences, it becomes more capable of evaluating ideas carefully rather than accepting them automatically. Building stronger thinking also requires emotional balance. Strong emotions can sometimes cloud judgment, making it difficult to evaluate situations objectively. When a person learns to observe their emotions without allowing them to dominate decisions, thinking becomes clearer. Emotional awareness allows the mind to recognize when feelings are influencing interpretation. Instead of ignoring emotions, the person acknowledges them and then examines the situation logically. This balanced approach preserves the insight emotions provide while preventing them from overwhelming rational thought. Another part of strengthening thinking is learning from mistakes without attaching unnecessary judgment. Many people weaken their thinking by reacting harshly to their own errors. Instead of examining what went wrong, they focus on criticism and frustration. A stronger mindset treats mistakes as valuable information. Each error reveals something about how the situation was interpreted or handled. When the mind approaches mistakes with curiosity rather than shame, it extracts lessons that improve future decisions. This approach gradually builds wisdom because each experience contributes to deeper understanding. Clarity of purpose also strengthens thinking. When a person understands what they are trying to achieve, their thoughts become more organized. Decisions are evaluated according to whether they support that purpose. Without clear direction, the mind easily becomes distracted by short-term impulses or external expectations. Purpose acts like a guiding structure for thinking. It helps the person prioritize actions and filter unnecessary distractions. Over time, thinking becomes more focused and deliberate because it is aligned with meaningful goals. Patience is another important quality in developing stronger thinking. Mental growth rarely happens instantly. Just as learning any skill requires time, strengthening the mind involves gradual improvement. A person who expects immediate perfection may become discouraged when old habits occasionally return. Patience allows the process to unfold naturally. Each moment of awareness, reflection, and learning contributes to the long-term development of mental strength. With patience, progress becomes steady rather than forced. As stronger thinking develops, the mind becomes more resilient. Difficult situations no longer cause immediate confusion or panic. Instead, the person approaches them with calm analysis. They examine the situation, consider possible responses, and choose actions that align with their understanding. This resilience creates a sense of stability. The person trusts their ability to navigate challenges because their thinking is guided by reflection rather than reaction. In the end, building a stronger way of thinking transforms how a person experiences life. The world begins to appear less chaotic and more understandable. Decisions feel less overwhelming because the mind has learned how to analyze situations calmly. Confidence grows naturally from the clarity that comes with disciplined thinking. Over time, the person realizes that the strength of their life's direction depends largely on the strength of their thinking. By continually refining the way they interpret and respond to the world, they build a mind capable of guiding them towards steady growth and meaningful progress. Your mind is not fixed. It is a system that learns through repetition and experience. The thoughts you allow to repeat eventually become beliefs, and those beliefs quietly guide your behavior. When you begin observing those patterns, you gain the ability to reshape them. This process does not happen instantly, but every moment of awareness weakens the influence of the old patterns. Over time, new ways of thinking begin to feel natural. Decisions become clearer, reactions become calmer, and confidence grows from understanding rather than impulse. Life starts moving in a different direction, not because the world changed, but because your thinking changed. When the mind becomes intentional instead of automatic, the path forward becomes easier to see.